Daggerheart has more rules than you might expect. Some of these combat rules can feel pretty confusing at first, especially if you're used to D&D, like I am. So here are the 20 combat rules in Daggerheart that I wish I knew earlier. Rule 1. The GM is in charge. This first rule is more of a reminder. In Daggerheart, the GM can make a GM move at any time. Even though there's a bunch of rules about fear and combat and other things, the book says that the GM is always in charge. The Game Master can step in to keep the game moving, make sure everyone is having fun, and keep the story exciting. But this kind of GM power should only be used in emergencies. Most of the time, you should follow the other rules if you want to play the game as it was intended to be played. Rule 2. No combat rounds. In Daggerheart, there aren't traditional combat rounds like in other games. There are only turns. During the turn, a GM can do certain things, and so can the players. If one or two of the players decide to attack, that doesn't mean the GM or the other players are locked in combat with them. And in fact, the other players or GM could try to find a diplomatic solution out of the situation still. Rule 3. Player attack rolls. Attack rolls in Daggerheart work just like other rolls in the game. Players roll their hope and fear dice to see if their attack works. If the hope die is higher, they get a hope point. If the fear die is higher, the GM gets a fear point. If the total of the dice equals or beats the enemy's difficulty, the attack succeeds. If not, it fails. If the attack hits, the player rolls damage based on the attack, or the target makes a reaction roll to see how much they've been affected. But all that information can be found on the character sheet and the cards. Rule 4. Experiences. Players can use their character's experiences, the custom bonuses they've added to their sheet, to get a bonus, usually +2, on any roll, including attacks. Each experience used costs 1 hope. If a player has more than 1 relevant experience, they can spend extra hope to stack these bonuses. For example, using 2 experiences on 1 roll would cost 2 hope and give a +4 to the roll if the experiences are both +2. The player just needs to explain how that experience helps them in the moment. Adversaries sometimes also have experiences in their stat blocks. These can be added to rolls when they make sense, but it costs the GM 1 fear to do so. Rule 5. Reaction rolls. Reaction rolls are rolls that are made in reaction to someone else, attacking or using an ability on the target. Sometimes it may say on a feature, such as a spell, that the target makes a reaction roll, but more often than not, reaction rolls will be caused by the environment. For example, a trap is set off and rocks fall from the ceiling, make a reaction agility roll to see if you can dodge them. Reaction rolls do work differently from normal rolls in Daggerheart. When you're asked to make a reaction roll, you still roll 2d12s like normal and add them up to see if you succeed or not, but the hope and fear dice don't matter here. They don't create hope or fear points, and they don't affect whether the GM gets to act. Players can still spend hope to use an experience as a bonus for the reaction roll if it makes sense though. Rule 6. GM turns. The GM can spotlight an enemy adversary to do something, including attacking a player, whenever a player rolls with fear or misses an attack. Since players will often miss or roll with fear, this means the GM will get to act a lot. Sometimes after almost every player's turn, depending on how hard it is to hit the enemy. A GM also does not have to use its turn to spotlight an enemy though. They could just add complications to the scene, such as a hazard in the environment, like fog rolling in, or having the battle change in some way, like more enemies arriving. Rule 7. Spending fear. The GM can also spend a fear point at any time to make a move, such as spotlighting an enemy and make an attack. The GM can keep spending fear points to have different enemies attack, however they can't have the same enemy attack twice in one GM turn. They need to let a player go first before using that same enemy again. This means that a GM gets to go if the players miss, roll with fear, or if the GM spends a fear point at any point. Rule 8. GM attack rolls. When the GM makes an attack roll for any enemy, they roll a d20 instead of d12s. Hope and fear dice aren't used here. If the roll is equal to or higher than the player's evasion score, it's a hit. If it's lower, it misses. Rule 9. Meets it, beats it. If a roll matches the target number exactly, it counts as a success. So if a player's evasion is 14 and an enemy rolls a 14, it still hits. This rule applies to everything in Daggerheart. If it meets it, it beats it. Rule 10. Always round up. And just while we're on rolling numbers in general, always round up in this game. If damage or another number is halved and you get a fraction, round up instead of down. For example, if 7 damage is halved for whatever reason, it would be rounded up to a 4 instead of down to a 3, and you would never use a fraction. Rule 11. Adversary action economy. When the GM spotlights an enemy, they can move it up to 30 feet, which is close range, and take one action. That action could be an attack, talking to a player character, or interacting with the environment. Basically, they can move and they can do one thing. If the Game Master wants to move the enemy farther than 30 feet, they can, but the entire turn is spent moving. No action is taken. The book says if the GM wants to move the adversary somewhere beyond their close range, but within their far or very far range, this uses the entire action, but the adversary doesn't have to succeed on an agility roll like a PC would. It's not super clear whether that range is up to 100 feet far or 300 feet very far. Personally, I'd house rule it as 100 feet, but I feel like the intention is that it's up to the GM depending on the enemy that's trying to move and the terrain. Rule 12. Player action economy. When a player is in combat or doing something time sensitive, they can move up to 30 feet close range and do one thing, like interacting with something, using an ability, or making an attack. If a player wants to move farther than 30 feet in a turn, they need to make an agility roll to safely reposition. If they fail, the GM decides what happens. Like, they might still move that distance, but take damage from an enemy or a hazard, or they might get stuck on something and not finish the move. The GM sets the difficulty of the agility roll based on the area or terrain, and it's always worth letting the players know the potential consequences of a roll like this before they do it. Rule 13. Difficulties. Whenever a player tries to do something like hitting an enemy or moving farther than 30 feet, the GM, or the stat block for an enemy, sets a number they need to roll to succeed. This is called the difficulty. And the core rulebook has a handy guide for how you should set difficulty. If the thing you're trying to do is very easy, for example, then set the difficulty at 5. If it's easy, then set the difficulty at 10. If average difficulty, 15. Hard, 20. Very hard, 25. And nearly impossible, 30. And if it's obviously impossible, they can't roll. Don't have them roll. There's no way they can succeed. 15 is a good average difficulty if you're unsure. Adjust it up or down based on how challenging you think it should be. And difficulties don't have to be multiples of 5, by the way. This is just for this example. You can set it at anything you want. If the player is rolling against an adversary, then unless specifically specified in the ability or spell or whatever they're trying to do, then they're always going to be rolling against the enemy's difficulty. It's universal for all checks. Rule 14. Ranges. Ranges in Daggerheart are a bit abstract. Instead of measuring exact distances like squares or feet, the game uses these zones. Melee is right next to you, which is 5 feet. Very close is between 5 and 10 feet. Close is 10 to 30 feet. Far, 30 to 100 feet. Very far is 100 to 300 feet. And out of range is beyond 300 feet. The book also includes an optional rule for using a standard 1-inch battle mat, like this. Melee is one of these squares. Very close is 3 squares. Close, 6 squares. Far, 12 squares. Very far is 13 plus squares. And out of range is simply off the board. I personally like using feet, so I keep a note of these ranges on my GM screen. It's super useful. Rule 15. Spotlighting. In Daggerheart, whoever is actively describing what they're doing, whether it's a player or the GM, they have the spotlight. In combat, because there are no traditional rounds, if players keep rolling successfully with hope dice, they can keep taking turns one after another without the GM stepping in. This means a single player could theoretically keep moving and attacking repeatedly, if the other players were okay with that, and if the GM did not want to interrupt by using a fear point. The idea is for players to respect each other and share the spotlight. However, if you're worried about one player hogging the spotlight and just taking way more turns than everyone else at the table and that causing issues, the book suggests using an optional rule called a spotlight tracker. Each player gets a set number of actions, like say 3, which they track using tokens. After using all the actions, they must wait for everyone else to use the actions before they can go again. When they take an action and use a token, they put the token in the middle so everyone can see and everyone can keep track. You can also simplify this by allowing just one action each. If a player goes, they can not go again until everyone else has gone, but honestly, just going around the table in a more traditional initiative order is probably better for that. What I will say is if you're new to Daggerheart, don't give up on the initiative-less combat just yet. Sometimes it can take a few sessions for the table to get used to it, especially if you come from D&D, but once your table does get their head around it, it's a game changer. Rule 16, Hope in combat. Players can spend hope points in several ways during combat. One of the coolest uses is by helping an ally. By describing how they assist another player's action, the ally gains advantage where the helping player rolls a d6 to add to the helped player's roll. And this can stack if multiple players help. So 4 players helping all get to roll a d6, and all of them get to add it to the attacker's or the person rolling's final roll. Hope can also be spent to use an experience and get that bonus that we spoke about earlier, as well as activate special features on cards, and it would save everything on the card, or to initiate a tag team roll, which we'll cover next. Rule 17, Tag team rolls. Tag team rolls are fun combos where 2 players work together to do something cool. For example, Captain America reflecting Iron Man's laser off his shield, or Aragorn tossing Gimli at a bunch of orcs. Mechanically, both players roll to hit. They then choose the better of the 2 rolls. If both hit, they combine their damage. If they rolled with hope, they both get a hope point. If they rolled with fear, the GM gains 2 fear points. What this means is that the players get to do something really memorable and fun. They get to bond and they get a higher chance of hitting the target. The amount of damage they would have done remains the same, but it does all get added together and counts as one attack. There's a few catches, however. Each player can only do a tag team once per session and it costs 3 hope. However, if player 1 does it with player 2, then player 1 uses 3 hope and can only do that once per session, but player 2 can immediately spend 3 hope of their own and do their once a session tag team back with player 1. Tag team rolls are a great way to start or finish a fight. Rule 18, Adversary Tiers. Adversaries are grouped into tiers to help balance encounters. There's 4 tiers, and tier 1 is for level 1 characters. Tier 2 is for level 2 to 4 characters, Tier 3 is for use for levels 5 to 7, and Tier 4 is used for characters who are level 8 to 10. This doesn't mean you should only have 1 enemy per encounter from one of those tiers. Instead, it's a guide for what kind of enemies to choose for your player's level. The core rulebook has a battle point system that helps you decide how many enemies to use and what type depending on a bunch of things, like how many players you have and how long you want combat to last. But this system probably needs a full video to really explore, so expect that soon, and of course, subscribe. Rule 19, Attacking multiple targets. In Daggerheart, if one attack can hit multiple targets, like an area of effect attack, or like an attack that splits into 3 and hits 3 people, or a melee attack that could sweep through multiple targets, you only ever roll to hit once and then roll damage once. Then that applies to everyone being affected. So if you miss the first guy, you miss everyone. But if you hit the first guy, nice. And in this video, and also all future videos probably, you may hear me say things like roll to hit. This is because I'm brainwashed by D&D. In Daggerheart, you don't really roll to hit when you attack. It's more about rolling to see if the attack is successful. It is a nuanced thing, and it's important to differentiate, and I'm sorry if sometimes my language gets a bit confusing. I'm going to get better at that. Oh, and players can also hit multiple enemies at once if they're close together, like hitting a group with some kind of explosive blast. If the GM agrees, of course, it has to make sense. But if it does make sense to both the players and the GM that an attack would affect multiple people if they were all within 5 feet of each other, or 5 feet within where like the attack hits, then roll with it. It's all good. Rule 20, Hordes. A GM can use a special type of adversary in combat called a horde. This represents a group of multiple creatures close together like a pack of zombies. In the stat block, you'll see something like 2/HP in brackets or 5/HP in brackets. That's the health of each individual creature in the horde. For example, if zombies have 2 HP in brackets and the horde's total HP is 6, that means there are 3 zombies in the group, each one with 2 HP. When players attack the horde, if they do enough damage to drop the total HP to 0, they take out the whole group. If they only deal some damage, the GM can describe how they kill, say, 1 zombie, or take out 2 zombies. I personally love the idea of hordes for Theatre of the Mind play, but on a battle map they can be tricky to track, so I think I'll be using hordes sparingly in my miniature heavy games. Rule 21, Defeated Adversaries. If the players manage to get an adversary down to 0 hit points, they are defeated. But this doesn't necessarily mean that they're dead. It could be that they just got knocked unconscious, or even that they are now tied up. Getting to 0 HP in Daggerheart just means that the enemies are no longer a threat. Rule 22. Falling and collision damage. Falling damage is an optional GM rule in Daggerheart, but it's likely to become standard at most tables. Here's how it works. If a character has a very close fall, aka between 5 and 10 feet, they take 1d10 plus 3 damage. If they fall a close distance, that's 10 to 30 feet, then they take 1d20 plus 5 damage. If they fall either far or very far falls, which is 30 to 300 feet, they take 1d100 plus 15 damage, or they just instantly die if it makes sense for the scene. It's up to the GM. Players can use their armor slots to reduce falling damage. All falling damage still converts to hit points based on damage thresholds. If a character hits something at a dangerous speed, and that's up to the GM's interpretation of what that means, the character takes 1d20 plus 5 direct physical damage, but they can't use armor slots. But you can always increase and decrease the amount of damage that a player takes from falling or flying through the air fast to make it make sense for the story. Rule 23. Massive damage. This is another optional rule, but I think many tables will adopt it. Massive damage is an extra damage threshold which is triggered when a player takes damage that is double their severe damage, and it means the player marks 4 hit points instead of 3. I also kind of want to homebrew a rule where if a player takes double that damage, the character just straight up dies, because it wouldn't survive just being hit that hard. But that is not in the core rulebook, that's just a me thing, and it may be completely broken in practice, so take it with a grain of salt. Rule 24. Underwater fighting. And another optional ruling, underwater fighting and moving underwater. So if you have a player underwater and they do an attack roll, it has disadvantage unless it makes sense for that character to easily fight underwater. This is the same for both players and the GM. Also, if a character can't breathe underwater, the GM can set a countdown for how long they can hold their breath. The book suggests setting the countdown die's starting value to 3 or higher and to tick the countdown down whenever the character takes an action. You can also use a GM move to tick it down once, so every time a PC fails a roll or rolls with fear. Once the countdown ends, the character must mark a stress whenever they take an action. There's actually quite a lot to keep track of here, but it is a fun way to add a lot of stress to scenes that take place underwater, with players seeing the countdown going down, having to really think about every action since it will eventually lead to them marking hit points. Rule 25. PvP. If your group is okay with it, players can attack each other or challenge each other. Player versus player attacks work just like attacking an adversary. The attacking player rolls against the target player's evasion. If a player wants to beat another player in another way, like racing or an arm wrestle or winning some kind of game of intelligence, both players roll and whoever rolls higher wins. If the rolls tie, the instigator wins, although I personally don't like this idea and I would prefer they just have to re-roll if it's a draw. Critical Role fans will be familiar with this as a game of rollies. Rule 26. Death. When a character marks all their hit points, they must make a death move, and they have 3 options for this. They can go out in a blaze of glory, the character dies, but they get to take one final action that critically succeeds, meaning a guaranteed success, and if it's an attack, high damage. The second option is the character can avoid death. The character falls unconscious instead of dying, they're out of the battle, and they regain consciousness either by being healed, which can happen at any point, or by the party taking a long rest. But this does also have consequences. The first is that the GM adds complications for the rest of the group in the fight, so the fight gets harder. And the second is that the character has to roll their hope die. If it's equal to or below their level, they gain a scar and permanently lose a hope point. And if they eventually lose all their hope points in this way, the character just has to retire and leave the life of adventuring because they've lost all hope. The third option is that they risk it all. The player rolls their duality dice, and if the hope die is higher, they stay up and heal by the number on the hope die, which they can divide that number up and either clear hit points with it or stress with it. So that's great. Roll with hope, back up, heal themselves, get back in the fight. But if the fear die is higher, then the character straight up dies. Oh, and if it's a critical success, they heal to full and clear all stress. So that is insanely good. But that's why it's such a gamble. If you're lucky, you could be back on your feet and you could turn the tides of the entire battle. But if you're unlucky, you die. It's like a 50-50 chance. But in this death, you don't get any benefits at all. You're just done. Saying that, resurrection is possible in Daggerheart. There is a spell for it, but also a GM can always allow creative ways to bring a character back. The advice in the book about this is just don't make it too easy. Anyway, that's a bunch of Daggerheart rules that at least really helped me get my head around combat. I could probably make a similar video to this for a bunch of rules outside of combat too, so if that's something you're interested in, like the video and share it everywhere and anywhere. It's a huge help, and thank you for watching.